It's great to be here at the World Affairs Council, and it is an honor to be on this stage with James Verini. They Will Have to Die Now, Mosul and the Fall of the Caliphate is, it seems to me, the most powerful book I've read about the aftermath of the Iraq War, which is to say, the Iraq War, what's going on now. The battle against the Islamic State, the Iraq War that Americans have forgotten. Is it one of my impressions on reading the book is that the key word for American foreign policy is not containment, it's not predominance, it's amnesia. We've been engaged with Iraq, deeply engaged with Iraq since the early 1980s, when actually the late 70s, when Zbigniew Brzezinski gave the green light to Saddam to invade Iran. We tilted toward Iran under Ronald Reagan, or toward Iraq, under Ronald Reagan, funded Saddam's battle against the Iranians. Finally, Saddam's regime, bankrupted by that war, invaded Kuwait. We sent 500,000 troops over to Saudi Arabia to kick them out of Kuwait. There ensued a period of sanctions in which the Iraqi economy was destroyed, and then came 9/11. In which 19 jihadists, none of whom were Iraqis, attacked the United States, and the United States responded by invading Afghanistan and then Iraq in a misbegotten war that killed 5,000 Americans, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, we'll never know how many, but had two significant consequences for the region. The first was to dramatically increase Iranian influence, which we hear about every day now as if it wasn't related to the Iraq War. And the second was to create an organization called the Islamic State. And James Verini's extraordinary book is about the battle with the Islamic State, bloody as it was, and also deeply embedded as it was in the American psyche, even if Americans are trying to forget it. I will begin by asking you about this relationship between America and Iraq and how it affected your own travels there. Because in a funny way, you were there during the backwash of the Great War. After the vast numbers of American troops had gone, the vast numbers of American journalists had gone, there you were.
So the original impetus when I first went on assignment in summer of 2016 was to write about life in the Islamic State. For the first time since the war had begun in 2014, 2 years later, ISIS was on its heels, and it was retreating quickly towards the northwest of Iraq. And you could go to, and by you I mean a journalist, could go to Fallujah and Tikrit and Ramadi and speak to Iraqis who had recently been liberated, if we want to use that word, from the Islamic State and talk to them about how life had been. You could also meet jihadis who were still, milling about undercover, but not terribly well disguised. And you would meet many, many Iraqis who would admit to you pretty soon into the conversation that they had supported, abided the Islamic State. There was a deeper motivation for me that was a decade and a half in the making, which was when I was a newspaper reporter at the New York Observer in 2001, my first real newspaper job. I was 23. The first big story I covered was 9/11. Mm-hmm. You recall when the New York Observer was a real newspaper, and so ever since then, jihadism had been on my mind, and America's place in the world, and American adventurism in the Middle East and other parts of the world. And like everyone else, I watched as we launched into a stridently irrelevant war in Iraq. But I never went to Iraq, and I always felt strangely guilty about it. I started writing kind of full time about conflict in around 2011, and even as a conflict reporter, I never went to Iraq. And so by 2016, I felt I just kind of had to. I felt that I owed it somehow to American readers and to Iraqis, if that doesn't sound too pompous.
Why didn't you go? Why didn't you go earlier?
Fear. I covered a lot of conflicts in Africa, which were conflicts, but they're small. Mm-hmm. And the war against the Islamic State was a big war. This was a war that of the sort that we hadn't seen in decades. I think also there was a certain amount of guilt. I felt terribly guilty, as I hope many Americans do, about what we had done in Iraq, mm-hmm. and I didn't know how to process that or how to write about that. But then I eventually figured I had to, and it was no secret that ISIS was a direct outgrowth of the American era in Iraq, of the invasion and occupation. So, and yet at the same time, ISIS was this wholly dastardly enemy. So I kind of got to make my cake and eat it. Is that the expression? Make my cake and eat it too? Make my bed and eat my cake?
I think you have your cake and eat it too.
I think you make a bed and a cake, and then you cake eat.
Don't combine them.
I got to have it both ways, because I got to go sort of face up to the shame and the guilt of an American in Iraq, but also write about what was a totally black enemy that deserved to get beaten, and that was getting beaten. And so I could... and into the mix, I could write about war in a way that I'd never had, because this war had real set-piece battles, and territory was being taken, and blocks and houses were being fought over. It wasn't until I'd been there for many months that I kind of realized that the real motivation had been a certain moral guilt, feeling that I had to finally go to this place.
Do you think that guilt also had a lot to do with the relationships you eventually had with the Iraqi people? And what's striking about this book is the very close relationships with a number of Iraqis who, I shouldn't tell what happens, but they turn out to have a closer relationship to the Islamic State.
I want them to buy the book, yeah. So, yes, I went there with the intention, and I'm glad to say that I was able to carry it out, of telling the story of this war entirely from Iraqi points of view. I don't say the Iraqi point of view because that's silly. There is no one monolithic Iraqi point of view, but the points of views of Iraqi civilians and soldiers and jihadis. And as I describe in the book, what I always found invariably, even from jihadis, was this remarkable generosity of spirit towards Americans. I mean, Iraqis have every reason to hate America, right? And some of them do. But I very rarely encountered hatred or contempt. What I most often encountered in my discussions with Iraqis about America and about America's role in Iraqi history, because America now defines modern Iraqi history, right? We are the genesis of their new epoch. What I almost always found was a curiosity and a warmth, and a generosity of spirit. The Iraqi conception of America is really complex and fascinating. You can't really understand it until you go there. They still think of America, for all of its depredations that we've visited upon Iraq, they still think of America as a power second only to God's. They think of America and Americans as omnipotent and omniscient. And aside from the fact that they usually think I'm a CIA agent as well, there's a larger psychological phenomenon, which is that they believe that America is the greatest power in the world still, and that it does whatever it likes, and that one of the things a great power does is hurt people very badly and manipulate people. So when in conversing with Iraqis, civilians, soldiers, jihadis, there was always this mixture of respect and suspicion and awe and disdain mixed into every conversation. They all knew perfectly well that ISIS came directly out of the American invasion. In fact, most Iraqis I got to know well, the soldiers in particular. I should say Iraqi men, because as you know, having worked in that region, it's very difficult to talk to women. The men generally don't allow it. In certain instances, I was allowed to, but I should stress that these are male perspectives, for what it's worth. Almost every Iraqi soldier I met, including intelligence officers who should have known better, and their idea was that the United States was not just backing the Iraqi troops against ISIS and running the air war against ISIS, it was also backing ISIS. They all believed that the United States was funding, arming ISIS as well as the Iraqi troops. And when I would say, well, how could that be and why would we do that? They would say, well, that's what a great power does. You start a war and you run both sides of it. And they didn't say that with looking for an apology. There was definitely a sense of respect to that belief. However wrong-headed it was.
I must say that you kind of paint that paranoia, which was certainly there in 2003 to 2006 when I was covering the war, with extremely vividly, including the feeling of powerlessness when you confront it,
right?
Because people cannot be convinced that their paranoia is not true.
Right. You're absolutely right. It is a function of powerlessness.
It totally is. The other thing that struck me that was a constant in your depiction of Iraqis and the relationship to Americans, and this is true of other places where the U.S. has fought wars, certainly that I've covered, they are forced to know more about us than we know about them.
You bet, yeah.
And it's just, that is the dynamic. And I thought it was a wonderful narrative part of this book that in the families that you get to know best, you find out things about them rather late in the book that you had not observed early on, because it seemed a perfect model of this idea that we know what's going on, and in fact we don't. And it's one of the voluptuous things about reporting, actually, when you discover in this gradual way your own ignorance.
Yes.
And there is that plot line in this book.
Mm-hmm. And you're always rediscovering your own ignorance in a place like Iraq, as you know, because the U.S., as you say, has been inextricably bound up with Iraq now for 2 generations, but also because there's just so much history there. Proverbially, it's where we get it's the culture that gave us culture, in our conception of culture. And there's so many layers of history. And whenever someone points out a kind of what they think is an exemplary point of Iraqi history, there's always a counterexample to be offered. I'm sorry. Yeah.
You also depict the sadness of that history's destruction under the Islamic State. When I got to Baghdad in 2003, I had wanted for my entire life to see the Baghdad Museum.
Yeah.
I was a kind of Middle East nerd when I was a kid, and I was desperate. And I walked in, and there was nothing but headless statues and smashed items. And it was one of the few times I wept. I literally, because there's something, not to bodies, but you weep at that kind of destruction.
You had the destruction of history and the attempt to eradicate a people's story. Yeah, one of the great, not tragedies, one of the great depredations of ISIS was that they eradicated entire histories particularly from northern Mesopotamia. Mosul, for centuries and millennia, had been this extremely diverse place. We don't tend to think about diversity of this sort in that region, but Mosul had been home, of course, to Muslims, Shia, Sunni, Sufi, but also to Zoroastrians, to Chaldean Christians, Assyrian Christians. It had a huge Jewish population. Not huge, huge for Iraq at one time. In fact, one of the ancient Hebraic term for West Mosul was Hebrew fortress. So historians think that perhaps after Judea was taken by the Assyrians or the Akkadians, that a huge Jewish population Hebrew population moved up to northern Mesopotamia. And until very recently, Mosul was known for its religious and ethnic diversity. You had Turkomen, you had Shabak, you had Kurds, Arabs, of course, Persians. So this started to diminish greatly under the Baathists, and then ISIS did away with it entirely. And as you say, that's in its way even sadder than the act of murder is the act of eradication of these
Culture.
histories. Walking into the Mosul Museum, I had a similar reaction, just a gutting, particularly since Iraqis put so much store, rightly, in their history, including their pre-Islamic history. Saddam, we tend to forget, Saddam turned Iraq into one of the most literate countries in the region and the world. He won an award from UNESCO for his efforts to educate women. It's bizarre to think
He
now.
restored Babylon as well.
Well, yeah, and put his own name
Controversial.
on his own name on the bricks. But he also made the study of Mesopotamian history, going back to the Sumerians and the Akkadians, a central part of Iraqi public education in a way that it had not been before or has been since. So I met a lot of older Iraqis, including some older soldiers who'd been educated in the Ba'athist era, whose knowledge of Mesopotamian history was, of course, superb. And when you take away from a people, as ISIS did, and as Saddam did to an extent, and as the American occupation did, when you take away from a people the material evidence of that history, you're also taking away the history, because soon enough it's not going to be studied, and it's not going to be remembered.
Parts of the book reminded me a little of, had to, I suppose, of my first weeks in Iraq in 2003, when you seem to encounter a different kind of war.
Yeah.
That, the Iraqis weren't fighting with tanks, all that was long over, and what they were fighting with was suicide bombings. I was in Baghdad when 5 bombs went off in the same day, and it was my glory as a reporter to be close to one of them, which sounds very perverse, but in fact is the case.
It's what you live for.
It's what you live for. And I had the sense, reading your book, that this was the second stage of postmodern war. That, this mixture of high tech and barbarism, which characterizes the Islamic State. I want to get into the idea of why people join and things like that, but can you talk about how they fight?
Well, it was such an ironic war in this sense, right? Because ISIS was so successful in its way, right? Al-Qaeda had long talked about taking territory. It never got around to it. There had been other jihadi groups who'd taken a lot of territory, the Taliban being the most notable contemporary example, but there have been many examples over the centuries, including going back to the beginning of Islam. There were revolutionary movements that took territory, and this is how they asserted themselves and changed the religion. But ISIS was so successful, and the mark of its success was that it created the caliphate, that it actually took so much of Syria and Iraq in a matter of months and created a caliphate, just as it said it would do, and created the caliphate as it was taking the ground, even more remarkably, coming up on the fly with laws and social norms and city constitutions, as they did in Mosul, and taking over school systems and the municipal governments. But that success also meant their end, because as soon as you start taking territory, you have to hold that territory, right? So William Tabor said in The War of the Flea that the first thing a guerrilla learns is don't take territory. But they took a lot. And
War of the Flea is the classic on counter-insurgency.
Right, on guerrilla warfare that's now become a manual for guerrillas. And so now they had to defend the territory, which also meant that though it was an extremely progressive, if we want to use that word, jihadi organization and insurgency, it was also regressive because it was kicking war back into the 20th century. Now there would be, once again, set piece battles. There would be territory, fought over. There would be house-to-house, block-to-block fighting, which is exactly what happened in Mosul. The Pentagon called it the most significant urban combat since World War II, which, whatever that might mean, I think for number of men and material and the scale of the destruction, that's probably true. It's probably bigger than Hue or Sarajevo, and so in one sense they were regressing war to the 20th century, right? And the Americans finally got what they wanted for 20 years, which was a chance to face the jihadis straight up. But in another sense, it was, as you say, futuristic and high tech. It was. I'd like to say, I've been abusing this cliche, but I'm going to say it again. It was the first smartphone war. This was the first war that was conducted largely by smartphone. The Iraqi soldiers all had smartphones, and they had these mapping applications that that would meticulously, every night when they stopped moving, stopped taking streets, the commanders would all call in their GPS coordinates, and the mapping application on the phone would update,
show them all.
if only by a matter of inches. So everyone knew where everyone was. Everyone knew, tens of thousands of soldiers. Everyone knew where everyone was. The strike, I spent a lot of time with the coalition air coordinators, Americans and French and Iraqis. The strike requests that were coming in from the Iraqi field commanders, passing up the chain, the strike requests were all being discussed over WhatsApp.
Amazing.
Which, is simultaneously preposterous and wonderful. Probably more preposterous than wonderful. And then, of course, there was the documentation of the war. Everyone had a smartphone. Iraq is a middle-income developed country. 3G was standard. And not even ISIS could take the phones away from the people, though they tried. So the jihadis, of course, as we know from their prolific propaganda, but also the soldiers and the civilians were constantly documenting this war, and the world was consuming this war on social media and in other ways, or via the propaganda. I mean, ISIS's magazine, Dabiq, was so good that news organizations actually used their images.
It's amazing.
And did not have to pay license fees, what's more. And so in this sense, it was this astonishing leap into the future, right? In Afghanistan and Iraq during the American wars there were, Americans had digital like camcorders and this kind of thing, and little SLRs, but nothing like this. This was on an entirely another scale, and it was the astonishing leap into the future, even as ISIS was bringing war back to the 20th century.
I mean, it is fascinating the way ISIS is this internet. It's impossible to conceive of it without the internet.
Oh, of course.
I mean, it's this group that it's impossible to conceive of without the internet, and also without its Air Force, which are suicide bombers.
Right.
I mean, it has strategic weapons.
Yeah.
They're suicide bombers.
Yeah.
And they've developed it from that moment in Iraq where you had 5 suicide bombings in one day, cut forward, 16 years.
Yeah.
And they're using them by the tens, by the dozens. It's astonishing.
Well, to your first point, what was your first point?
About the internet?
Right, yes. So the Islamic State was virtual in so many ways. It was a virtual state in the way that you could only pull off in the age of the internet, right? So much of it was online storytelling and propaganda. So many of these young fighters were actually useless as fighters. They were cannon fodder, if that. But what they were was great online storytellers who recruited all of these people to go live there. And we have to remember that not everyone who moved to the Caliphate, to the Islamic State, went in order to fight. A lot of them were devout Muslims, or so they fancied themselves, who went there to live under God's law. The suicide bombers. Over the development of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda and then Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then finally ISIS, suicide bombing went from being a kind of a bespoke niche industry within the jihadi community to the main. Yeah, this is their most effective way of killing. So in Mosul, the way they did it was, the way they killed the most Iraqi troops as well as civilians was through what are called vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, VBIDs. VBIDs, which doesn't roll off the tongue. And these were cars and trucks filled with explosive and then with armor of one kind or another welded on top of them, and then the driver welded into the driver's seat. So there's no way this guy's getting out of there. And they had these things stashed all over Mosul. hundreds of them. And they quickly became the most deadly and effective weapon just for casualties. I think the Iraqi Special Forces casualty rate was like 40%. But also for psychological warfare, these things were frightening to behold. They were incredibly loud, and they sent off these mushroom clouds into the sky that looked eerily like early model nuclear bomb mushroom clouds. And you just always knew when a V-bit had gone off. The reverberation was like nothing else. It was in its way worse than the worst airstrikes.
Let's go back a second to what would lead someone to live in the Islamic State. I always, what's that phrase? When I hear the word evil, I reach for my revolver. I hate. It always seems to me a simplistic analysis to say this organization is evil. These people are evil, and yet they did indeed massacre 1,500 people on one occasion, young men at Camp Spiker. They are known for burning people alive. They're known for beheading people. They're known for killing people in the most gruesome ways.
Cruel
And gruesome,
aesthetically egregious.
And yet
ways,
you met several people who had been part of the Islamic State.
Right.
And, Americans have this idea of so-and-so was radicalized. It's like they take a pill or something. You know, it's some odd, mysterious process. I wonder if you can talk a bit about why a young person, usually obviously a young man, would be attracted in Iraq to the Islamic State.
First on the question of evil, and then you'll remind me because I'll forget about the second part again. So you're right. I don't know what the word evil means. I'm not a religious person. I've read a lot of religious texts, and evil is always defined differently in them. I would say that ISIS came as close as I would like anyone to come to evil, in that they were, at least in their hardcore, a nihilist death cult. It had, like any insurgency or any organization, it had many gradations of belief within it, right? I think it had many pragmatic members and leaders who thought that they could turn ISIS into something like Hezbollah or Hamas, which is to say, a permanent part of the regional political landscape. There were others who were thoroughgoing millenarians who were killing precisely because, from their readings of the Islamic apocalyptic literature, they believed that killing was the way to prime the ground for the end times. This is an explicitly described thing in the Hadith and the Quran and other literature.
Or also that they wanted to get it over with, as in the management of savagery, as quickly as possible.
Yes, although clearly they delighted in drawing it out as well. So in that they were a nihilistic death cult at their hearts, I don't know what evil means, but I can't think of anything more darker than that. And when it comes to motivation. As to why people joined the Islamic State, so many different reasons. As we talked about, some didn't want any violence at all. They wanted to just go live in an Islamic State, which had been an idea that had been, it's not a new idea. Muhammad was creating an Islamic State. The Kharijites, who were the first great Islamic revolutionary group in the 8th century AD, were creating an Islamic State, as were the Assassins, as were the Ottomans. In Iraq particularly, I can't speak to Syria, I didn't work there. In Iraq particularly, the appeal I found was as much political as it was religious. In fact, it was more so. The Iraqis whom I interviewed who admitted to abiding the Islamic State and joining it, for them the Islamic State was, in its inception at least, an alternative to the Iraqi government. These are mostly Sunnis we're talking about. Sunnis who, since 2006, when Nouri al-Maliki was essentially installed by the American government, Sunnis who'd come to be so abused and ignored by the Nouri al-Maliki government, which is essentially a Shia nationalist government, and the Dawa party, which is the Shia nationalist party that basically runs the Iraqi government. These Sunni Iraqis had come to be so abused and ignored by the government, so abused by the army and police, jailed indiscriminately, summarily executed, deprived economic opportunity. They had become so desperate by 2014 when ISIS entered the country that they believed it was a viable alternative to the government, the only alternative that was really presenting itself, because by that point, Maliki had been going after all the prominent Sunni politicians and forcing them into exile or imprisoning them. The Sunni political movement, such as it existed in Anbar and Diyala and Nineveh, had been decimated by Maliki, and Sunni Iraqis believed that they were being targeted and that ISIS was the answer to that. That's how desperate they'd become, that this transparently sadistic, if not insane, organization appeared to them to be the only viable political alternative, and
the only alternative that could protect them.
That could protect them against Maliki, and that offered them some sense of hope. You know, the way that Baghdadi and ISIS appealed to Iraqis was not primarily as a millenarian extremist religious group. They presented themselves as a group that would restore Sunnis to economic and political prominence, that would, restore Iraqi society to order. When they came into Mosul, they didn't force women to dress entirely in black abayas and hijabs, and they didn't force the men to grow beards, not yet. What they did was they introduced a new city constitution. They forbade people from having weapons. They cleaned up the streets. They opened new markets. They lowered rents. You talk to Moslawis about the first days of ISIS in Mosul, and it's strikingly, eerily similar to their opinions about the Americans' first days in Mosul, which are always positive. David Petraeus made his name in Mosul in 2003 and 4, and Moslawis still speak resoundingly favorably of Petraeus because he did precisely the same thing. He revived the city, and that's what ISIS did at first as well.
It's perhaps useful just to remind people that Saddam was a Sunni leader leading a minority government, minority autocracy. The Sunnis represent perhaps, 20%, something like we don't know.
Now no one knows because now it's not, you can no longer put sect on identification papers. It just says your religion.
Well, you didn't know then either.
No, right, exactly. No one has the real numbers.
But it's unsettling to think of ISIS, as James is now describing them, as a restoration in effect. And in fact, there's a lot to argue that they were a restoration. Not least, we haven't mentioned this, but the number of former officers, particularly intelligence officers, in the upper bureaucracy of ISIS. A lot of them were trained by Saddam.
Well, absolutely. Many Sunnis saw this as a restoration. I think many Sunnis saw it as their answer to 1979. They saw it as their Iranian revolution in a way. They felt that Iran had been growing in prominence in the region since 1979 at least, but certainly since 2003. And that it was fundamentally opposed to Sunnah Islam, and that this would be their answer to the 1979 revolution. Some of them were very, very hopeful about it, including a lot of people who were not particularly religious. None of the people whom I talked to who initially sided with ISIS, none of the adults, I should say, were particularly devout. The younger men were, or claimed to be, right? Because they needed something more kind of abstract to hold on to than mere municipal politics. But the adults were pragmatic people. They saw this as a pragmatic choice. They knew what they'd been experiencing for years, Moslawi men, which is being stopped at checkpoints for hours on end and being accused of being a Ba'athist and a jihadist, and watching your kids, both the men who are at the center of the sort of civilian side of the book, both their wives had been killed at checkpoints in 2006, 2005.
So the young people we're talking about, you described them a second ago as devout, but could you give us, I really want people to understand, and I want to understand why a young man raised in a so-called good family, when ISIS comes to town, even though they clean up the garbage and they do all these things, why that young man joins ISIS?
I mean, again, I think there are a lot of different motivations. We can look at the motivations of, let's take it a bit further afield. Why did a young man from Manchester or New Jersey want to join? we know because they've written a lot about this on the internet that it's what all men crave, which is a sense of belonging, a sense of value, as an outlet for their natural boyish violent urges. There's that. There's just the very kind of human, typical adolescent element of it. For Iraqi young men, there were a lot of the same motivations as the adults. If Iraqi young men hadn't themselves been abused by soldiers or deprived of economic opportunity by the government, they'd seen it happen to their fathers, to their mothers, and it clearly brought on, very understandably, a deep sense of shame. One of the characters in the book, as you recall, subjects in the book, is a young man who deeply sympathized with ISIS, and he was also extremely ashamed of his father. He'd watch his father just sort of become more and more downtrodden over the years, and that shame, you can never overestimate the power of shame to drive people. In many ways, ISIS was a movement of shame, as is any revanchist movement.
The United States would do well to realize that when it occupies countries. I mean, I would
argue that the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was in part motivated by shame. The shame of having been attacked, in 9/11 and having no one to strike back at. Well, we're just horribly ashamed and hurt, and we've got to attack someone. So here's this. Is that even English? What is it?
I'm translating it.
Okay.
It's interesting. There's a question here, which
are we now transitioning into this portion of the?
Well, we'll talk about shame, and we'll continue talking about what we've talked about. I think shame is a great. I'd ask the audience to remember those films from Iraq early in the occupation, in which American soldiers would hold down Iraqis by putting their feet on their heads, and those people you could almost predict would join the insurgency if they weren't, because there's nothing more shameful.
But then being touched by a shoe.
Yeah.
It's almost as bad as a dog.
And you'd think, I remember seeing this again and again during the early phases of the war and thinking, can't some commander figure this out?
Right,
Why
you're
is
just
this?
manufacturing.
Yeah, you're creating.
Jihadis.
I just saw 20 jihadis created on the street corner.
Right.
I got
a quick aside to what you just talked about. One of the most tragic things is when you are in the field and you meet American commanders, officers and enlisted both, you realize how much smarter they are than we give them credit for.
Absolutely.
And so many American commanders objected vehemently to the invasion of Iraq, and including Mattis, who said it out loud to the White House, and many others as well. Very few generals agreed with it, and very few colonels for that matter. In talking to American commanders while talking about my book and also being in Iraq, they are so cognizant of the mistakes, right? And many of them did not agree with it to begin with. And there's this tragic sensibility because Iraq created these people. Iraq created their military careers, this country that we ruined.
Yeah, David Petraeus, and James Mattis.
And Petraeus doesn't strike me as a, I think he probably, Petraeus is one of the few guys who actually did a great job in Mosul. It wasn't his fault that he got pulled out of there. Anyway, so that adds to the tragic sort of sensibility of the American presence. There's so many American commanders are perfectly aware of the horror of it and what they did.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's fascinating reporting on the military, isn't it?
Yeah, they don't. I think
the Iraqi military as well.
The Iraqi military is much more fascinating. American military reporting has changed so much since the early part of the Iraq War. They are so wary of the press now, and particularly under Trump, they just don't see any reason to cooperate with American reporters or any reporters, and they don't have to. So I found them pretty impossible to deal with.
I thought you characterized the Iraqi military rather brilliantly by describing how they would reach a certain point, they'd still be under fire. There were all sorts of houses that weren't cleared. There were snipers, there were everything else. And there was a pause, and they jumped out of the vehicles.
Get the cigarettes.
Took the cigarettes out.
Get the phone.
Took the phones out, checked their phones. No perimeter, no, not wearing flak jackets, half the time not wearing helmets.
No.
This complete fatalism.
Force protection or individual protection. Oh yeah, it was. It would have been more wonderful if I wasn't relying on these guys to protect me.
Did you feel a little bit? There is actually a scene where a shell or something comes in, and the general you're with kind of just is nonchalant, and you crouch, and he cracks up.
Abdul Wahab, who a couple days ago was arrested. I would get a mortar would whiz in, a shell would whiz in, and I would get low as you're supposed to do. And he would just look at me and laugh. Mm-hmm. And he was never touched. I mean, he was one of these guys like Robert Duvall in Apocalypse Now. You just know he's never going to get a splinter.
Mm-hmm. I have a few questions here. The first is something we've been talking about, which is why should I, as an American, care about the conflict between different religious sects in Iraq? I think you did well to talk about the fact that these conflicts between sects, part of this conflict originated with the American War.
Yes.
Very much so.
The Sunni-Shia schism goes back to the beginning of Islam, and in many ways it defines Islam. And particularly in Iraq, because Iraq is where Shiism really grew up, in Najaf and Karbala. Mm-hmm. So we can't be too self-critical or glib about placing that in the recent past. That there's no way to say it. War between the sects has been going on for a millennium and a half, and certainly Saddam was, by the end of his regime, brutal towards the Shia. Thousands of them went into exile. He killed major Shia political and religious leaders. He would routinely have imams from Karbala and Najaf assassinated. He really started it, but needless to say, the American era did not do much to help.
Well, this dynamic, though, the project of the Americans was to go in, supposedly create a representative government of some kind, which would have been a Shia government simply because of numbers. And in effect, there is a Shia government.
At least a more Shia government.
There is a Shia government, and the Sunnis who were powerful, the powers before, are now put down. Yeah. And the dynamic that we've been discussing was pretty predictable from the get-go.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of the scene where Kanan Makia and several other Iraqi exiles go and visit George W. Bush on the eve of the war.
Yeah.
And they mention something about Shia and Sunni, and they discover the president hasn't heard these words before, or at least doesn't know the difference. Doesn't really know the difference.
Yeah, about the Caliph Ali or any of this. Yeah, it's frightening to look back at how much a very small cabal of mainly Shia exiled intellectuals brought on this war. Kanan Makia, whom I like, but Ahmad Chalabi and a few others. Yeah, the Americans very unwisely did the bidding of and played into the hands of people like that and the Dahwa party, what it did was initiate a cycle of violence that we're still seeing. The immediate reaction was a growth of the Sunni insurgency, and then in a reaction to that was the growth of the Shia insurgency, Maqtal al-Sadr.
Which, by the way, the Sunni insurgents were trying to provoke. That was their strategy.
Yeah, in part, right. And then of course a reaction to the Shia militias and the Shia government was ISIS, and now a reaction to ISIS is mass Shia retribution against Sunnis. It's a sectarian cycle that's just going to go on and get worse. When I left in 2017, I was convinced there would be another sectarian civil war in a matter of months, and there hasn't been, but I wouldn't be the least bit surprised to see it begin tomorrow morning.
I remember having this perception in 2003 that Saddam, when the insurgency was beginning, Americans didn't understand that Saddam was the product of political dysfunction, not the cause of it.
Oh, he was both.
But this American idea that you can pluck him out.
Right.
and things will be fine.
Yeah.
That really was, their model was Eastern Europe. You know, you take these regimes down, they become democracies.
Yeah, no, it was, as you say, an amnesiac idea. We had tried it in another country in Southeast Asia a few decades before. And hadn't worked there either.
Nobody remembers that.
Are we supposed to be reading these, or?
One or two. Someone asks about the logistics of your own safety in reporting. There are a lot of scenes in this book where shells come very close and other things come very close. Can you talk? You emphasized before that you hadn't covered a war like this before.
Yeah, not on this scale.
Can you talk about this a little bit? How you actually lived to write this book?
Thank you for that. I'm very brave. As you recall, when you're actually doing it, you're not really thinking about safety so much. You're thinking about doing mainly you're thinking about getting a good story, right? Mm-hmm. So you're trying to, especially as a print reporter, you're trying to observe as much as possible, and you're trying to find people who will talk to you, and you're trying to describe things you see. And I never found that my own safety was very much a concern. I never felt particularly unsafe. There were a few close calls that in retrospect, like clearly I could have died very easily. Mm-hmm. But at the time, you are so focused on working and on just keeping on moving that you don't really stop and think about it. There were a couple of instances where the car was nearly hit by RPGs that were clearly aimed at my car. There was another time where, it's not in the book, where I was in a truck with a bunch of Iraqi reporters and ISIS gunmen shot up the truck and blew up the engine block, and we had to run for it. But I don't know about you. I just think it's fun, frankly.
Me too.
I mean, you're like,
it is fun.
It's just a blast. If you don't think it's fun, you shouldn't be there.
No, I agree.
And also, maybe you're lying.
It is a lot of fun, which people think is nuts when you say this.
Normal life is boring, man.
I dedicated one of my books to my mother in partial answer to a question: why can't you go somewhere nice for a change? Which is what she would always ask me.
Yeah.
Can't you go somewhere nice for a change? Why do you have to do this?
People always say, how can you do that? And I'm like, you've never tried it. It's really good. It's really a rush.
Did you ever worry that and this definitely has happened to me, that you were endangering people who were, whether they were, not in your case Americans, but Iraqis who were trying to protect you?
No. I always found, did you ever hang out with the Kurds?
Yeah.
Okay, so the Kurds are nuts. Mm-hmm. And they're so much fun. They're wonderful. So when you're out with the Kurds and they're like assaulting a town, you're like, dude, just slow down. I mean, they're great, and I always felt like they were endangering me, not the reverse. The Iraqi special forces and regulars were much more concerned about the safety of journalists. I always found that Iraqi, particularly the generals, whenever they noticed me, they would insist that I go with them, not because they wanted the coverage, but because they were really worried about foreign journalists. Right. God bless them. Eventually, they got so worried about foreign journalists and were so fed up with what they considered to be unfair coverage that they just kicked us all out of Mosul. Mm-hmm. But to your original question, I don't know what you have found, but in looking back on the times where I was close to death, it doesn't come with any like regret or trauma.
None.
No.
Seeing other people, I mean, at times I've seen people that I've been interviewing then killed, and that I've felt bad about that.
I mean, I always felt, you can't help but feel like a bastard voyeur when you are standing there and someone's kid gets blown open, which I saw a lot of, or someone watches their father or their brother die on a gurney. I'm not a photographer, so I don't feel quite as bad. I can hang back, and they don't have to see me being obtrusive. I can just hang back and watch. The photographers, I don't know, I would be so angry if my father just died and there was someone shooting it. But still in all, you feel, I don't know if you ever felt this way, but I felt really just bad, that I had to see them in this moment, and that they have to put up with me, this foreigner, who can just leave at any time.
But I also find people are incredible, have incredible forbearance.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
and,
absolutely.
I was with photographers once in Sarajevo after the market massacre, when we went into the morgue and doctors started beating the photographers.
Oh yeah,
literally with a stick to get out.
The Iraqi troops hated having their casualties photographed, and they would. One day I was there with Paolo Pellegrin, and we were at this triage station in East Mosul, and Paolo was shooting. And if you're a good photographer, you have to get up close. You can't do it from afar. And an Iraqi soldier came up to him, and in English said, "If you take another photograph, I'll burn your vehicles." Mm-hmm. Paolo kept on shooting. He didn't burn our vehicle. He didn't know which vehicle was ours.
There's a question here about allegations that some of the neighboring countries, I'm assuming we're talking about the Saudis, have helped the Islamic State, our so-called allies.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a word about that?
Sure. You can't really report on that kind of thing on the ground unless you're finding rocket shells that are stamped like product of Saudi Arabia, which I've actually found, but that was in Sudan. In the documentary research I did, reading reports about where ISIS's funding came from, the RAND did a bunch of very good reports. Some of these small or arms tracking organizations that work in conflict zones. The whole Gulf thing was very overstated. The Islamic State was, by 2014, an extremely sophisticated organization economically.
Right.
They had accountants, they had meticulous bookkeeping, they had files on all of their members and the revenue tiers and family housing allowances. I'm not joking. This was all built into the Islamic State budget. At one time before 2014, they were taking in $1 million a day in Nineveh province, mainly from extortion, taxation, smuggling rackets, oil bunkering, and agriculture, real estate. So much of the revenue, most of the revenue, almost all of it was internally generated. It was not Saudi donations or Gulf state black finance. I think that was all very, very overstated. The Islamic State had spent years becoming a very sophisticated bureaucracy.
This continues the questions about neighbors. The first is about how the Syrian conflict was affected by the Iraq War. And the second, how did the Iranian Revolutionary Guards affect the Iraqi conflict?
I'll take the second question first. So Iran was clearly involved. A big factor in the war in Iraq against the Islamic State was the Shia militias, the Hashid Shabi. And they were being, in large part, funded by and armed by Iran. Everyone knew that. That was an open secret. In one instance, the Battle of Tikrit, the Al-Quds, the Iranian forces actually came into Iraq. The Iraqis allowed them to come in remarkably to fight ISIS, because at that point the Iraqis were so desperate and they were losing the war.
And the Americans were essentially their air force.
At that point, less so, but yes. And there were Americans around Tikrit as well, and of course they could not interact with the Iranians, so it was this weird, awkward thing. But the Tikrit was eventually won, and it was astonishing to think that there were Iranian regulars fighting in Tikrit. That's the only instance of that I know of. But Iran's presence was everywhere, so much. In the same way that they had armed and funded so much of the Shia insurgency between 2003 and 2011, so they also were funding and arming so much of the Shia militia from 2014 to 2017. What was the other part of that?
The other question was about the relationship to the Syrian war.
Well, Syria is where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi allowed his people to militarily train. If it had not been for the few years before 2014, in which ISIS metastasized in Syria, there's no way they would have been able to take so much ground in Iraq so quickly. So the Syrian war was a training ground for ISIS as well as part of its caliphate. In terms of how the American era in Iraq destabilized Syria, that I can't speak to. I don't know. I've never worked in Syria.
There's a fascinating piece for whomever asked this question or whoever else is interested in Der Spiegel by Christoph Reuter about the formulation and the construction of the Islamic State and its bureaucracy in Syria.
Yeah, Rania Abu Zaid also wrote a brilliant piece about that.
Oh, really? I didn't read that.
For Politico,
but he found these remarkable documents. Maybe the same documents.
I mean, the sophistication with which they built themselves up in Syria was pretty remarkable, and also, as you pointed out, the degree to which they allied with former Baathists and former Iraqi army and intelligence. Until shortly before that, the Sunni religious AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and the former Baathists and nationalists didn't much like each other. They didn't work together often. But Baghdadi or whomever in the Islamic State managed to forge this alliance that was, at first, it seemed invincible. I mean, this is why their columns rolled into these cities almost unopposed, because the Iraqi troops knew perfectly well that former Iraqi troops were fighting with ISIS, Iraqi troops that were much more able than the new Iraqi troops.
And a lot of these people were from the various innumerable intelligence agencies and had been trained, many of them in the Iraqi army. One of the things it was very good at was explosive engineering.
Yeah.
And you see that kind of expertise
Yeah.
carried over.
I mean, that's one, that was a legacy of Saddam's, was just a militarized state with members who'd been de-Baathified and deprived their military pensions, who were looking for something to do.
Great idea. Invade a country and then fire the army and throw them all onto the street.
That's the first thing.
That was a brilliant strategy.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions here about the role of women in ISIS itself, and another question about the role, about whether you encountered any Yazidi women. And can you talk about that?
The Yazidis, yeah. So I spent some time in Sinjar, which is the epicenter of Yazidi culture in northern Iraq. Mount Sinjar was where so many Yazidis lived, and as you'll recall from the news coverage, they were, massacred en masse there as ISIS proceeded up the mountain. I did interview a number of Yazidis, and pretty astonishing stories, needless to say. For those of you who don't know, it was the Yazidi women who were press-ganged into sex slavery by ISIS, which is something that's been covered a lot, but it should be covered more. I mean, just that. If you want to talk about evil, the ISIS Department of War Spoils, which is what the sex slaves fell under, kind of like what's it called, the Joy Division, the Nazis. I did interview a bunch of Yazidis. It was not, I'm sad to say, germane to my reporting. So it didn't find its way into the articles or the book. Yeah. What was the other thing?
The other question was the role of women under the Islamic State.
Yeah, so it's so difficult, as you'll recall, it's so difficult to interview women in Iraq because of cultural mores and Islamic cultural mores and just Iraqi mores. There were a few instances when I was hanging out with these families in the refugee camps where if there was a particularly sort of liberal-minded father, he would allow his daughter to talk at length. And there's one woman like that in the book, and to whom the book is partly dedicated, in fact. Maha was her name. Other than that, it was impossible to talk to women. You were not, as a matter of cultural respect, you wouldn't just approach a woman and begin talking to her. That's just not okay. So one voice that's sorely lacking in the articles and in the book is women's voices.
It should be said that
I'm sad to say
you are going to start a restaurant with Maha.
Maha, we're gonna James Kosh tashrib is the Iraqi dish that I love.
Well, I think we will all look forward to
Everyone's
going to
invited
that
to Mosul.
Ladies
For the grand opening.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Philippe Stark is designing the thing.
will you join me in thanking James Verini?